My mother called to tell me I wasn't invited to my parents' anniversary party. Her own son. And somewhere on my desk, I didn't know it yet, sat a red folder with a $150,000 loan approved in my name. "Don't take it personally, Matthew," she said. "It's just easier this way." I didn't argue. I hung up and told myself I was fine. That was a lie. 4 hours later, my brother Elijah posted a photo from the party. My parents smiling. Extended family. Candles on the table. The caption read, "Family only." 2 words. I read them maybe 6 times. Not because I didn't understand them, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what they meant. I understood completely. What I didn't know yet was that while I was sitting alone staring at that photo, a $150,000 loan had already been funded in my name. My identity, my credit history. Used without my knowledge, without my consent, and wired directly into my brother's LLC. That red folder has everything. Every timestamp, every transfer, every record of exactly how they did it. If you've ever been the one quietly holding everything up while someone else took the credit, you need to hear this. And they called it times family only. I'm a structural engineer. I design the parts of buildings that keep them from falling down, the load-bearing walls, the steel beams, the hidden framework that nobody sees but everybody depends on. I've been doing it since I was 24. I'm good at it. My parents never once asked what I did for work. I don't say that to sound sorry for myself. I say it because it matters to understand how this family operated. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes with being the reliable one. You don't get asked how you're doing because everyone assumes you're fine. You don't get celebrated because your success is treated as expected. Baseline, the floor, not the ceiling. You become the thing the house is built on, and nobody thinks about the foundation until something cracks. Elijah was the one they talked about. Elijah was the one they called with good news and celebrated at the table and introduced to people at church. When he walked into a room, my mother's voice changed. It got lighter, faster, the way it does when someone makes you genuinely happy. I noticed that when I was maybe 11 years old, and I spent the next 2 decades trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. I was not doing anything wrong. That took me a long time to understand. For 3 years, starting the month after my father had a health scare and couldn't work full hours, I sent money home. Every month, consistent. No drama, no negotiation, no expectation of gratitude. I covered a significant portion of their mortgage. I watched the payment clear my account and told myself it was the right thing to do, and then I went back to work. I didn't talk about it. I didn't bring it up at holidays or use it to score points in arguments. I just did it, quietly, the way I'd been trained to believe that was how you proved your worth. They never asked me to stop, so I didn't. What I didn't understand at the time, what I couldn't see from inside it, was that my consistency was constructing something. 3 years of regular, on-time financial activity connected to their address. 3 years of a paper record that reflected a responsible, credit-worthy person who took his obligations seriously. I was building something real without knowing it. And I wasn't the only one paying attention to what I'd built. Elijah, meanwhile, had gone through 2 failed businesses in 5 years. The first one, a logistics company he'd launched with borrowed money, collapsed inside 18 months, and the people he'd borrowed from were not the forgiving type. The second one, a food distribution idea that never got past the planning stage, left behind nothing except a registered name and a few domain purchases he'd put on a credit card he stopped paying. My parents talked about him like he was one good opportunity away from turning it all around. They used that phrase constantly. One good opportunity. I heard it at Thanksgiving. I heard it at Christmas. I heard it every time I made the mistake of asking how things were going at home. A third business, a small LLC, mostly on paper, had been registered quietly a few weeks before the anniversary party. I didn't know that yet. I had no reason to. The month before the party, my mother left me a voicemail. I almost didn't listen to it. I'd been running a brutal site week, 14-hour days, a concrete pour that kept falling behind schedule, the kind of compounded exhaustion that makes the drive home feel longer than it is and makes your hands feel slightly disconnected from the rest of you. I came home, saw her name on my phone, set it face down on the counter, and made dinner standing at the kitchen counter because I was too tired to pull out a chair. It was only later, lying on the couch with the TV on and nothing registering, that I picked it up and hit play. She was asking me to co-sign a loan. For Elijah, she called it a small thing. She used the word times just times 3 times in 40 seconds I counted. Later, when I listened again with different ears, just a signature. Just to help him get started. Just because family helps family. Her voice was warm, practiced. The kind of calm, unhurried tone you use when you've already decided how something is going to go and you're just waiting for the other person to catch up. There was no hesitation in it, no apology. Just the steady confidence of someone who has asked this particular person for things before and always received them. I set the phone down and went to bed. I did not call back. I did not agree. I did not text. I did not email. I did not send any kind of reply. I assumed that silence was its own answer, that a person asking you for something and receiving nothing back would understand what nothing meant. That was my mistake. Not the silence itself. The assumption that they needed my permission. They didn't wait for it. The bank's letter arrived on a Thursday. It wasn't addressed to my apartment. It was forwarded from my parents' house, my old address, the one I hadn't lived at in 6 years, the one I'd never updated because there'd never been anything important coming there. Until now, the envelope was plain, windowed, the kind that looks like a utility bill until you read the return address and your stomach drops before your brain catches up. I opened it standing in my building's mailroom. I read the first paragraph twice. Then I sat down on the floor. The letter was from a regional bank I'd never had an account with. It was a payment notice. 30-day reminder on a personal loan originated 8 weeks prior. Loan amount? $150,000. Borrower of record. Matthew, my full legal name, spelled correctly, social security number partially redacted but present. I had never applied for this loan. I had never spoken to this bank. I had never signed anything. I sat on that mailroom floor for probably 4 minutes. I know because I watched the timestamp on my phone flip from 6:18 to 6:22 and didn't move once. My briefcase was still in my hand. I hadn't put it down. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Someone's package was leaning against the far wall. Normal Thursday details that my brain kept registering because it didn't know what else to do with itself. My mind was doing what it does on a job site when something structural fails, running fast through every possible explanation, trying to find the one that means it's not as bad as it looks, landing on nothing useful. There was no explanation that made this okay. I drove home. I didn't call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me and pulled up the bank's website. I called the number on the back of the notice, worked through the automated system, and reached a live person. I gave them my name. I kept my voice flat. I told them I'd received a payment notice and that I had no record of this account. The representative asked me to verify my social security number. I did. She confirmed the account existed, that it had been opened in my name 8 weeks ago, that the loan had been fully funded, and that the current balance was $149,200, reflecting one payment that had apparently already been made. I wrote that number down in neat digits on the back of the envelope, pressing hard enough that the pen left an impression in the paper beneath it. My hand was steady. The rest of me was not. I asked her where the funds had been sent. She said she couldn't release disbursement details over the phone, but that I could request a full account statement and transaction history in writing, or visit a branch with valid ID. I asked if she could tell me where the application had been filed from. She paused. Then she said the application had been submitted online. I thanked her and hung up. I sat there for a long time, not panicking. Exactly. Something quieter and colder than panic, the feeling of looking at a wall you thought was solid and realizing there's nothing behind it. I'd spent my entire career calculating load tolerances, stress points, the exact amount of pressure a structure can absorb before it fails. I was good at knowing when something was about to give, and I had completely miscalculated the one I'd been living inside. Then I remembered the voicemail. I found it still in my phone. I hadn't deleted it, hadn't thought about it since the night I'd half listened and gone to bed. I played it again in the silence of my kitchen. Just a signature, just to help him get started. Just because family helps family. Her voice the same warm, practiced calm, but context is everything. The exact same words, heard from the other side of a $150,000 loan I hadn't agreed to, land completely differently. The warmth didn't sound like warmth anymore. It sounded like a performance for an audience that was never supposed to find out the ending. The loan application had been submitted online. 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks after that voicemail, my mother had called to ask for my signature. I hadn't given it, and the loan existed anyway. I opened my laptop and searched the routing number from the bank's notice. It resolved to a small regional institution, and the account it corresponded to was registered under a business name I didn't recognize. I wrote it down on the back of that same envelope, under the balance figure. Then I searched the business name in the state's LLC registry. Sole member, Elijah. I stared at my screen for a long time. The cursor blinked. Outside my window, the city was doing its ordinary Thursday evening things, traffic sounds, someone's music drifting down from a floor above, the distant wail of a siren fading east. All of it completely indifferent to what I was looking at. My name was on a $150,000 loan. The money was sitting in my brother's company. And the only evidence I hadn't agreed to any of it was a voicemail I'd left unanswered and a silence that, apparently, nobody had taken as a no. I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was careful in a way that told me he'd been expecting this call, or something like it. Not surprised. Waiting. I told him I'd received a payment notice from a bank I'd never done business with. I told him the loan was in my name. I kept my voice even, the same way I keep it on a site when there's a problem and the crew is watching to see how bad it is. He said, "We handle things in this family, Matthew. Not with strangers. Not times I don't know what you're talking about. Not times that can't be right. Not one syllable of confusion or outrage on my behalf." He knew. I set the phone down without saying goodbye. I looked at the envelope on my table with its two handwritten figures, $149,200, and the LLC name, and I went to my desk and pulled out a blank folder. Red, because it was the only one I had. I put the bank letter inside it. That was the beginning of the red folder. My father's response times "we handle things in this family" times should have surprised me more than it did. It didn't, because what I heard underneath it wasn't a denial. A denial sounds like confusion, like someone scrambling to understand what they're being accused of. What my father said was something else entirely, a management statement. A keep-it-contained instruction delivered in the same flat tone he used when the neighbors were too loud and he didn't want anyone calling the city about it. Keep the problem inside. Don't let it become something official. The problem was, it was already official. It had a loan number. The next morning, I took the day off work. I called my supervisor, said I had a personal situation, and got off the phone before he could ask questions. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, coffee I forgot to drink going cold beside me, and went through every bank statement I had for the previous 3 years. All of them. I printed them at home, spread them across the table in chronological order, and went through each page with a pen. Every transfer to my parents' address. Every month, same amount, same note in the memo field, home. Not rent, not loan, not anything with legal terminology attached. Just times home, because that's what I'd believed I was contributing to. 36 payments. I added them up twice to be sure. The total was significant. Not $150,000, but enough. Enough that any financial professional looking at these statements would understand immediately what they were looking at. A single individual consistently funding a household for 3 years, with his name and account number on every single transfer. Enough to establish that I was the one with the income, the stability, the credit history, and that I had been demonstrating all of that, voluntarily, in documented form, connected to that address, for 36 consecutive months. Whoever had prepared that loan application had known exactly what kind of financial portrait I had been painting, 1 month at a time, without realizing anyone was watching. I put those 36 statements in the red folder, each one a month. Each month a decision I'd made without understanding what I was actually building. The stack was almost 2 inches thick. Then I pulled up the voicemail. I listened to it 4 times. On the 4th listen, I used a transcription app and wrote out every word. Not because I didn't already know them, I did, but because I wanted them fixed on paper in a format that existed outside my memory. Just a signature. Just to help him get started. Just because family helps family, I wrote the timestamp underneath, 7:43 p.m. Then I went back to the bank's confirmation email, found the loan application submission date, and did the subtraction. 41 days. She had called me, delivered those words, received complete silence in return, And then 41 days later, someone had filed a loan application in my name from an internet connection I had no account with. I set the pen down and stared at that number. 41 days is not a spontaneous decision. 41 days is a plan with a contingency. The voicemail was the first attempt. Ask nicely, get the signature legitimately. When I didn't respond, they didn't stop. They moved to option 2. I spent the next hour on the phone with a bank branch manager who gave me considerably more detail than the call center had. The loan application had been submitted online. The email address on file was one I'd never used. The application had included a scan of my driver's license, high resolution, clean, the kind that comes from a flatbed scanner, not a photo taken on a phone. I thought about who had my driver's license scan. 3 years ago, my father had needed me as a secondary claimant on a property insurance form. He'd asked for a copy of my ID. I'd been on a job site, pulled over on the shoulder of an access road, and emailed it to him from my phone. He'd texted back, "Times thanks. Got it times within 2 minutes." I remembered that detail because I'd been annoyed at the interruption. Annoyed, and then immediately guilty for being annoyed, because it was a small thing and he needed it, and that was what you did. I had emailed my driver's license to my father 3 years ago as a favor. He had kept it. And when the time came, someone in that house had fed it into a scanner, attached it to a loan application, and submitted it alongside my name and my social security number and a credit history that I had spent years building. I sat there at my kitchen table with the printouts and the folder and the transcription on my phone, and I felt something shift in me that I don't have a clean word for. Not rage, not grief. Something more like the moment in structural analysis when you run the numbers a third time hoping they'll be different and they're exactly the same. The calculation is what it is. The only question is what you do next. I thought about calling my mother. For about 30 seconds, I seriously considered it, picking up the phone, telling her what I'd found, giving her the opportunity to explain. My hand was actually on my phone. Then I remembered my father's voice. We handle things in this family, and I understood that the call would accomplish exactly one thing: warn them that I knew. I put the phone down. I called a lawyer instead. The lawyer I reached was a referral from a colleague, someone who handled financial fraud and identity theft cases. I got her assistant, left a message, and received a call back within the hour. Her name was Carol. Her first question wasn't times what happened, times it was, times do you have documentation? I told her about the bank letter, the voicemail, the LLC, the ID scan, the bank statements. There was a brief pause on the line. Then she said, "Don't contact your family again until we've spoken in person. Don't call the bank again either. And don't move any of your own funds." I asked her why not my own funds. She said, "Because right now, everything is traceable and exactly where it should be. The moment you start moving money, it complicates the picture." I agreed to meet her the following morning. I hung up, sat back in my chair, and looked at the red folder on the table, thicker now than it had been 12 hours ago. Bank letter, 36 statements, voicemail transcript with timestamp, LLC, registration printout. Everything I'd gathered in a single day. And I already knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that could be. I went to bed at midnight. I lay there with the ceiling fan going and the city quiet outside and did not sleep well at all. I kept running the calculation in my head: 41 days, 3 years, 1 email, 1 unanswered voicemail, and landing on the same result every single time. They hadn't slipped up. They hadn't acted impulsively. They had looked at me, assessed what I had and what I was willing to give, decided it wasn't enough, and taken the rest. What they hadn't calculated was what I'd do when I found out. Carol's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, wide windows, neutral furniture, the kind of space designed to make people feel like their problems were manageable. I sat across from her with the red folder on the table between us and watched her read. She didn't say anything for several minutes. She turned pages slowly, paused twice on the bank statements, spent a long time on the voicemail transcript. I sat with my hands flat on the table and didn't fill the silence. I'd learned a long time ago on job sites that the worst thing you can do when an expert is assessing damage is keep talking. When she finally looked up, her expression hadn't changed much, but her posture had. She'd shifted slightly forward, the way people do when something moves from theoretical to concrete. "How long have you been sending them money?" she asked. 3 years, I said. She nodded once, the kind of nod that means times I thought so. And you have records of every transfer? All 36. Printed and in order. She made a note. Then she looked back at me. Identity theft at this scale, combined with wire fraud, that's federal territory. Before we go that direction, I want to understand one thing. Is there any version of events where you authorized this? A conversation you might have forgotten? Anything signed during a difficult period? I told her no. I told her about the voicemail, the 41 days, the email I'd sent my father with my ID 3 years ago. I told her I had never replied, never agreed, and had no idea the loan existed until the payment notice arrived. Saying it out loud, all of it in sequence, to someone writing it down, made it land differently than it had in my kitchen. Heavier. More real. I noticed my right hand had moved off the table into my lap. I put it back. Okay, she said. Don't reach out to your family, don't move your funds. Let me make some calls. I went back to work. That was harder than it sounds. Structural work requires the kind of focus that doesn't leave room for anything else when you're checking load calculations. Your mind has to be fully there, because the cost of being half present is measured in ways nobody wants to find out about. I managed it by treating each day as its own contained problem and leaving everything else in the red folder at home. But the awareness sat underneath everything like a low-frequency vibration I couldn't locate or turn off. My family was on the other side of the city going about their lives. And as far as they knew, I was still the person who didn't make things difficult. They were about to find out otherwise. I ran 3 site inspections that week. I signed off on a rebar layout that had taken 2 weeks to get right. I ate lunch at my desk and answered emails and did everything I was supposed to do, and the entire time, underneath all of it, the red folder waited at home like a structural report I hadn't finished reading yet. The calls from home started 4 days later. My mother called first. Her tone was the same warm, unhurried cadence from the voicemail practiced, smooth, the particular register she used when she needed something and wanted you to feel like agreeing was your own idea. She said she'd heard I'd been asking questions at the bank. She said she wanted to talk. She said whatever I'd been told, there was context I was missing, and that we should sit down as a family before things went somewhere nobody wanted them to go. There's a specific kind of anger that doesn't feel like anger at first. It feels like clarity. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to my mother explain that I was missing context, and I felt every cell of my body go very still and very clear. I didn't say anything. She said, "Don't take it personally, Matthew. You know how much we love you." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said I'd be in touch and ended the call. My father called the next morning. Less warm, more direct. He told me that Elijah was going through a difficult time, that the business needed a foundation to get started, and that the loan was a temporary arrangement, the kind families made for each other all the time. He said I wasn't being asked to actually pay anything. He said I should think about what it meant to be a brother. Family helps family, he said. That's what we do. Same phrase, verbatim, almost, from the voicemail. My mother had performed warmth and received nothing. Now my father was performing disappointment. The script hadn't changed, just the delivery. I told him I was handling it. I hung up. I did not record either of those calls, and that was a mistake I made exactly once. I wrote it in the margin of a notepad times record everything times and underlined it twice and circled it. From that point forward, every single call from any of them was recorded. From that point forward, every call from any of them was recorded. One-party consent state fully legal. Legal. Carol had confirmed it in our first meeting. 2 days after my father's call, Elijah sent a text. I want to be precise about this, because what Elijah wrote was not a denial and not an apology. It was a justification, the kind that only makes sense if the person writing it has already decided they're the victim of the situation they created. He wrote that he'd needed the loan to build something real, that the LLC was already generating traction, that not everyone had been handed a stable career the way I had. Then he wrote, "You don't even use credit, Matthew. You have a good job. What's the big deal?" And then, "I know you're upset, but this is fixable if you just stop making it a whole thing." I read it 3 times. Then I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Carol with no comment. Because that text said several things Elijah had not intended to say. It said he knew whose name was on the loan. It said he knew the money had gone to his LLC. It said he understood that what had been done was the kind of thing that required fixing, which meant he understood it was the kind of thing that was wrong. A person who has done nothing wrong does not tell you a situation is times fixable. A person who has done nothing wrong does not ask you to stop making it a whole thing. They ask you what you're talking about. He had handed me a written acknowledgement of awareness, unprompted, with a timestamp, from his own number. Carol's response arrived within the hour. This is significant. Save everything. Do not reply. I didn't reply. I added the screenshot to the red folder, now thick enough that I'd had to press the cover flat to close it, and pulled up the bank's online dispute portal. Filing the identity theft report was methodical work, the kind I understand. Dates, amounts, account numbers, the sequence of events laid out in the order they happened. I'd spent 8 years documenting structural discrepancies, recording what existed, what was missing, and what the gap between the two meant for the integrity of the whole. This was the same process. Different materials. Same logic. I filed the report at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I sat in my home office after the room quiet except for the hum of the computer and looked at the submission confirmation on the screen. Case number, timestamp, reference ID. Real now in a way it hadn't quite been before, not just a folder on my table but a record in a system, with my name on one side and the word times fraud times on the other. I printed the confirmation and put it in the red folder. Then I sent a copy to Carol. The calls from my family stopped the following morning. Abruptly, completely, not a gradual fade, but a hard stop, as if someone had made a decision. Which meant they'd gotten legal advice of their own. That should have made me nervous. Instead, it made me start thinking about what they'd need to hide. Carol called me on a Monday morning with a name, a forensic accountant her firm worked with on financial fraud cases. His name was David. She said he was going to need access to everything I had, plus some things she was requesting from the bank directly, using the formal fraud dispute as legal leverage. I brought the red folder to his office 2 days later. David was the kind of person who communicated almost entirely through silence and deliberate single-word responses, the kind of professional composure that, in a different context, would feel cold, but in this one felt like exactly the right thing. He took the folder, put on reading glasses, and went through it page by page without saying anything for 20 minutes. I sat across from him and kept my hands still and let him work. I'd spent enough time on job sites with structural assessors to understand that interrupting someone mid-evaluation doesn't help your case. You present the evidence. You let them read. You resist the urge to explain it before they've had a chance to see it. When he finished, he set the folder down, looked at me over his glasses, and said, "There's more." I asked what he meant. He said the bank had already provided IP log data in response to the fraud dispute, the digital record of where the loan application had originated. Carol had subpoenaed the corresponding ISP records through the dispute process. Together, they traced the application to a specific residential internet connection. Static IP address. Registered account. He pulled up a printout and set it on the table. IP address. Timestamp the exact date and time the application had been submitted. The ISP provider. The account holder name. My father. Not a coffee shop. Not a VPN. Not an anonymized or shared connection of any kind. Their home Wi-Fi, on a weekday evening, from the house I had been quietly funding for 3 years. I sat with that for a moment. There's a concept in structural engineering called a failure chain, the sequence of individual weaknesses that connect and compound until something collapses. No single flaw causes the disaster on its own. It's the accumulation. But in every investigation, there's a moment when you identify the first link, the original point where the load was transferred wrong, where the weight went somewhere it shouldn't have. Everything else follows from that. The IP log was the first link. All the other evidence existed because someone sitting at a desk in my parents' house had made a decision and submitted an application and believed the digital trail would disappear. It didn't disappear. It just waited. David wasn't finished. He'd requested the complete loan file from the bank, the full application package, not just the approval notice I'd received in the mail. It had arrived that morning. He opened a manila envelope and slid a single page across the table. It was a scan of my driver's license. I'd seen my own ID thousands of times. But there's something specific about seeing it attached to a fraud file, your own face, your own name, the date you were born, The license number you've had memorized for years in a context that has nothing to do with you. It was mine and it wasn't mine. A copy of something real used to build something false, and I was the last person to know it had been used at all. I set the page down carefully. David set a second page next to it. The file metadata on the scanned ID showed a creation date consistent with the year I'd sent it to my father, not recently manufactured, not altered since. It had been sitting in their digital records since the day I'd pulled over on a job site access road and emailed it as a favor, and it had been retrieved when it became useful. I added both pages to the red folder. The final piece came from the state's commercial registry. David had pulled the LLC formation documents, the full filing, not just the name and member listing I'd found in my initial search. The LLC had been formally registered 22 days before my mother left that voicemail. Not 2 weeks. 22 days. I want to be precise about why that matters. The voicemail was constructed to sound spontaneous. A mother calling her son, one family member reaching out to another, just asking, as families do. But the legal entity that would receive the $150,000 had already existed for 3 weeks before she ever picked up the phone. The structure was in place before the request was made. The voicemail wasn't an ask, it was an attempt to manufacture consent after the plan was already in motion. When I didn't provide that consent, they proceeded without it. David handed me the LLC formation printout. I set it next to the voicemail transcript, then next to the IP log, then next to the loan submission timestamp, then next to the routing record showing the transfer into the LLC account. 5 documents, 5 dates, 1 chain. I arranged them in order, left to right, across the table. David watched. Carol leaned in slightly. LLC formed. 22 days before the voicemail. Mother calls requesting co-signature. The ask on record. Matthew doesn't respond. No consent given. None implied. Loan application submitted from parents' home IP using Matthew's scanned ID. The act itself, with a location and a timestamp. $150,000 wired to LLC. The destination documented. Looking at them laid out like that, 5 pieces of paper in a row, each one a different angle on the same event, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. Each document alone was explainable. The bank letter could be a clerical error. The voicemail could be a coincidence. The scanned ID could be a forgery they'd deny. But together, in sequence, with dates that connected every step to the next, they stopped being individual documents and became something else entirely. A record, an argument, a structure that held its own weight. No gaps, no coincidences. No version of events in which this was a mistake or a misunderstanding or something that got out of hand. It had been planned before the first call was made. David looked at the row of documents and said, "Timeline." Just that one word. But the way he said it, quiet, certain, final, meant times this holds. Carol, who had joined us for this part of the meeting, leaned forward. "We take this to the FBI field office. Identity theft plus wire fraud over $100,000 is a federal matter. The timeline makes intent provable. The IP log makes location provable. The LLC registration makes the destination provable." She paused. "The voicemail makes premeditation provable." She let that last word sit in the room. I had not used that word before. I had thought I'd known it was the right word since the day I'd done the 41-day calculation, but hearing Carol say it out loud, in a lawyer's office with a forensic accountant across the table and 5 documents in a row, made it land differently. This wasn't a family betrayal anymore. It was a federal case, and I was sitting in the middle of it with the folder that proved it. My right hand, I noticed, was flat on the table again. Carol said, "Before we file, I want to give them the opportunity to face what they've done directly, not for their benefit, for yours. So that this ends in a room where you're present, not just on a document somewhere. You invite them to meet you. You choose the location. You control the environment. You have the folder. And we make sure the right people know exactly where you'll be and when." I thought about it. I thought about the mailroom floor, the voicemail I'd almost deleted. My father saying times we handle things in this family, times before I'd said a single word about what I'd found. My mother's practiced warmth. Elijah's text, "What's the big deal?" I said yes. That night, I sat at my desk for a long time after the meeting. I did not sleep easily. I'd been lying awake in stretches for the past 2 weeks. Not anxious, exactly, but alert in a way that sleep couldn't fully override. That night was the same, but different in texture. The fear was gone. What remained was a settled weight, like a structure that has been stress-tested and confirmed. The documentation existed. The timeline held. The math had been done. What was coming wasn't a confrontation I was dreading, it was a conclusion I had built, one page at a time, and was now ready to place in front of the people who'd believed I would never build anything at all. I got up around 1 in the morning and sat at my desk in the dark for a while. I opened Elijah's post on my phone one more time. Family only. The 2 words that had started all of this, the caption I'd read 6 times standing alone in my apartment while alone in my name was already 8 weeks old and no one had told me. I'd spent my entire career in a field where the distance between what a structure appears to be and what it actually is can cost everything. You don't assume. You test. You document. You verify until the result is the same every time. I had verified every single piece of it. I closed the app. I closed the red folder. The only thing left was to open it in front of them. I chose a place downtown called Meridian, a mid-sized cafe on the ground floor of an office building, the kind with tall windows facing the street and enough ambient noise to keep a conversation from carrying. I'd been there before for client meetings. I knew the layout. I knew there was a corner table near the back that put anyone sitting across from me with their back to the room. I reserved it for 11 in the morning on a Thursday. I texted my parents and Elijah the night before. 3 separate messages, same timestamp, same text. I think we should talk in person. Meridian Cafe, tomorrow at 11. I'll be there. No explanation. No indication of what it was about. I didn't ask if they were coming. I stated where I would be and left it at that. Carol knew the time and location. She had made her own calls. I arrived 20 minutes early. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and sat with my hands around the cup and watched the door. The cafe had its ordinary Thursday morning rhythm espresso machines, 2 people at laptops near the window, a server moving between tables. Nobody here knew what was about to happen at the corner table in the back. That normalcy was, in a strange way, exactly right. What I had built was not dramatic. It was documented. Elijah arrived first, which surprised me. He came in with the particular energy of someone who has prepared for the wrong kind of conversation, relaxed, almost casual, jacket on, coffee in hand, like he thought this was the version where we talked it out and I came around. He sat down across from me, looked at the folder on the table, and then looked at me with an expression that said he'd already decided how this was going to go. He said nothing about the folder. That was its own kind of answer. My father came in 2 minutes later, then my mother. They sat down without greeting me, which told me more than any greeting would have. For a moment, nobody said anything. My father spoke first. He said the situation had gotten out of hand and that there was a path forward that didn't have to involve outside parties. He said that Elijah's business was already showing early results and that the loan would be manageable once the revenue started coming in. He used the word times manageable times twice. He said the family needed to handle this together. Family helps family, he said. He looked at me steadily when he said it, the way he used to look at me when I was a teenager, and he wanted me to understand that a decision had already been made. I let him finish. Then I said, I want you to hear something. I pulled out my phone and played the voicemail. Not on speaker, I held it out across the table and let them lean in. My mother's voice, clear enough in the cafe's ambient noise, asking for just a signature, just to help Elijah get started, just because family helps family. The recording was 40 seconds long. I watched their faces while it played. My mother looked at the table. My father looked at me. Elijah looked at the folder. When it finished, I set the phone down. I said, that call was made 41 days before the loan application was submitted. I didn't respond. I didn't agree. I want to know how the application got filed anyway. Nobody answered. I opened the red folder. I put the first page on the table, the loan notice. I put the second page next to it, the IP log with the timestamp and my father's name on the account. I watched my father look at it. I watched the recognition move through his face before he controlled it. I put the third page down, the scan of my driver's license with the file metadata showing when it had been created. I put the fourth page next to it, the LLC formation filing with Elijah's name and the registration date. 22 days before the voicemail. I set the routing record down last. $150,000. Transferred to the LLC. Dated. I said, "You built this on my name. All of it." Elijah leaned back. He looked around the cafe, not at me, not at the documents, at the room, the way people do when they're calculating exits. Then he leaned forward and said, "You've always had more than you needed, Matthew. I just needed a start. That's what family does." He actually said it. Even then, the cafe had gone quieter than it should have been at that hour. The two people at laptops near the window weren't typing. The server had stopped moving. A woman at the table closest to us had her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and hadn't moved it in a while. I was aware of all of this the way you're aware of the structural load on a beam, not the focus of your attention, but present, registered, factored in. My mother said, "Matthew, please, don't take it personally. We love you. We can fix this." I said, "You already told me not to take it personally. On the phone, before I knew any of this existed. I'd like to know what fixing it looks like. Exactly, when there's a federal fraud record with my name on it." The word times federal times landed in the silence like a weight being set on a surface. Elijah said, "You didn't file anything. You wouldn't do that." I said, "I filed in November. Case number is in the folder." For a second, Elijah looked genuinely thrown. He glanced at my father, who said nothing. Then Elijah leaned forward and said, "Matthew, come on. This is family. You don't blow up your own family over a loan." I said, "You used my name on a federal loan application. I didn't blow up anything." Elijah started to say something else, and that was when the door opened. Two people came in. One of them I recognized as the FBI agent Carol had coordinated with. The other was a representative from the bank's fraud recovery division. They walked to our table with the particular kind of unhurried directness that does not require announcement. The agent looked at Elijah. "Are you Elijah?" he said. The table next to ours had gone completely silent. I heard a chair shift somewhere behind me. I did not look around. Elijah looked at our parents. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, the beginning of one more version of the same defense. But he looked at my father, and my father had both hands flat on the table and was looking at the documents, not at either of his sons. My mother had her hands clasped in her lap. She was looking at the routing record, the last page I'd put down, the one with the dollar amount, and not speaking. There was no script left. They had prepared for a version of this conversation where I was still the person who absorbed things quietly and didn't push back. That version of me had not shown up. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The cafe around us was very still. Then the agent said, "This is no longer a family matter." The agent's name was Reyes. He introduced himself briefly and with the particular economy of someone who doesn't need a room's attention, he already has it. He asked Elijah to step outside with him. Not a request, exactly. The kind of phrasing that sounds like a request but isn't. Elijah looked at our parents. My mother's hands were still clasped in her lap. My father was looking at the table. Neither of them said anything. Elijah stood up and went. The cafe had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that follows a specific thing rather than preceding it. I heard a chair scrape somewhere behind me. The server appeared briefly at the edge of my peripheral vision and then moved away. Life continuing around the edges of something that had just changed irreversibly. The bank representative, a woman named Sandra, who I'd spoken with once by phone, sat down in Elijah's vacated seat and began going through the process calmly and methodically. She explained that the bank had flagged the account as part of an active fraud investigation. She explained that they would be freezing the LLC's associated accounts pending the federal inquiry. She placed a packet of documents on the table and asked my parents to review them with their attorney before signing anything. My mother asked, "What happens now?" Sandra said, "That depends on a number of factors outside the bank's control. What the bank can tell you is that the loan originated under fraudulent application. That's going to have financial consequences for the accounts connected to it." She didn't say times your house. She didn't need to. My father understood. I watched him understand it the way I'd watched him process the IP log earlier, that brief, involuntary tightening of the jaw before composure reasserts itself. Except this time the composure didn't fully return. Something had gone out of it. The authority he'd always carried in rooms with me, the weight of a parent who expects to be deferred to, whose disapproval costs something, was simply absent. He was a man sitting at a table with documents in front of him that he couldn't explain away. He looked older, suddenly, and smaller. Or maybe I was just seeing him accurately for the first time in my life. My mother turned to me. Her voice had lost the practiced warmth. What was underneath wasn't grief, exactly. It was something smaller and more specific, the expression of someone who has just realized that the person they counted on to absorb consequences has stopped absorbing them. She said, "Matthew, after everything we've done for you," I looked at her. I thought about 36 months of mortgage payments she'd never once acknowledged. I thought about the voicemail she'd left as a formality after the plan was already running. I thought about the anniversary party and the two-word caption and the phone call where she'd told me not to take it personally. I said, "I'm not your structural support anymore." She didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. I wasn't asking a question or opening a negotiation. I was stating a fact that had been true for some time and was now simply acknowledged out loud. I picked up the red folder. I stood up. I nodded once to Sandra, once to Carol, who had come in and was standing near the entrance. Then I walked out. Outside, on the sidewalk, I stood in the late morning light for a moment and let the cold air settle around me. Through the glass behind me, I could hear, faintly, the sound of conversation continuing at that table, Sandra's measured voice, the rustle of documents, my mother saying something I couldn't make out, not my conversation anymore, not my table, not my problem to solve. I walked to my car and drove home. The weeks that followed moved on a timeline I was not fully in control of, which was by design. Federal investigations don't move at the speed of personal narrative. They move at the speed of procedure, methodical, documented, unimpressed by urgency. I had given them everything they needed. Now I let the process do what processes do. Elijah was formally charged 6 weeks later. Federal counts: identity theft, wire fraud. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, which surprised no one and changed nothing about the evidence. The timeline, the IP log, the scanned ID, the voicemail, the LLC registration date, the routing records, the text message in which he'd confirmed his own awareness, none of it had gaps. An attorney can work with ambiguity. There was no ambiguity. The plea changed 3 months after that. I wasn't in the room for it. Carol called and told me, briefly, what had happened and what it meant. I thanked her. I sat with it for a moment. Not with satisfaction, exactly more like the feeling at the end of a long calculation when the number you've been working toward finally resolves. The result was correct. The math had been right the whole time. The house came next. I had stopped the monthly transfers the day I filed the fraud report. 37 months of regular payments, and then nothing, not as punishment, not as leverage, just as the straightforward result of no longer being the person who funded that address. The mortgage, which had been manageable because of what I'd been providing, became unmanageable without it. Combined with the bank's fraud findings and the freeze on the LLC accounts, the financial picture at my parents' address deteriorated quickly. The foreclosure notice went out 11 weeks after the cafe. Carol called to tell me. She asked how I was doing. I sat with the question for a moment before answering. The honest answer was complicated. I told her I was fine, which was true. I also told her I didn't feel good about it, which was equally true. Those two things coexist more often than people expect. The house losing its structural support wasn't something I designed as a punishment. I hadn't calculated it as revenge or planned it as a final blow. I'd simply stopped providing what I had always provided, because the reason I'd been providing it, the belief that it was the right thing to do for people who deserved it, was no longer operable. The foreclosure was a load-bearing consequence. The predictable result of a structure that had been built on something that was never, structurally, going to hold. My parents called twice in the weeks that followed. I didn't answer either time. They were connected to an active federal case, and Carol had advised explicitly against contact. But beyond the legal reason, there was a simpler one. I had nothing left to say that would change anything, and I'd already spent the better part of 30 years saying things into that particular silence. My name was formally cleared from the loan 14 weeks after the FBI meeting. The bank issued written confirmation. The account had been opened fraudulently, the record would be expunged, and my credit file would be corrected with all 3 bureaus within 30 business days. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It arrived in a plain envelope, addressed to me at my apartment, which was the right address. I read it standing at my kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd stood 11 months earlier eating dinner, too tired to pull out a chair, before I'd listened to a voicemail that started all of this. The letter said, in official language, exactly what I already knew. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it written down by an institution with a letterhead. I put it in the red folder. I sat with it for a while after that, just held it. The weight of 2 paragraphs that had taken the better part of a year to arrive. Then I closed the folder for the last time and set it on a shelf in my office where it's been ever since, not hidden, not displayed, just there, the way documentation belongs. I accepted the job offer in the spring. It had been sitting in my email for 2 months, from a firm in another city I'd been in conversations with before any of this started. I'd been putting it off without fully acknowledging why, some version of feeling like I needed to be near what I was dealing with, as if proximity was the same as control. It wasn't. The work was done. The documents were filed. The process was running without me. I signed the offer letter on a Tuesday morning before I could talk myself out of it. There's a particular kind of decisiveness that comes from having already made the hard decision, everything after it feels lighter. I put in my notice at the end of that week and started packing the following weekend. The apartment had never been full to begin with. It didn't take long. I didn't tell my parents I was moving. I didn't tell Elijah. There was no message to send, no closure to negotiate. The people in my life who needed to know already knew, and that was enough. The people who didn't, well, they'd stopped being in my life, and they'd done that before I did. The new apartment was on a high floor with a window that faced west. On clear evenings, you could see the framework of a new building going up about 6 blocks away, steel beams rising floor by floor, rebar laid in the organized geometry of something that would hold weight for decades. Built correctly, one layer at a time, by people who understood what each piece was for and didn't pretend otherwise. I'd stand at that window sometimes in the early weeks and just look at it. There's a particular satisfaction in watching a structure come up clean. No shortcuts. No weight in the wrong places. Just the work, done right. I want to be clear about something before I close this out. I don't tell this story to perform strength, and I'm not telling it to invite anyone to celebrate what happened to the people I came from. The foreclosure was real. The criminal case was real. Those are consequences that belong to real people, and I don't take that lightly. What I take seriously is this. I spent years being the load, bearing wall of a structure that was being used against me. I stayed because I thought that was what family required. I kept sending money, kept my silence, kept absorbing, and somewhere in that process, I had mistaken endurance for virtue. It is not the same thing, not even close. The night I sat on my kitchen floor in the new city, actually on the floor, back against the cabinet, unpacked boxes stacked around me, takeout containers from dinner, the city doing its unfamiliar sounds outside, a good quiet in the apartment itself, I felt something I don't think I'd let myself feel clearly in a long time, or maybe had never had the space to feel at all. Not happiness. Exactly. Not relief, though there was some of that woven through it too. Something more structural than either. The feeling of weight distributed correctly. The feeling of a thing that holds. I was never the foundation they deserved, and I think somewhere I always knew it. I was the one they built on without asking. And the day I walked away, the whole thing came down exactly as any honest engineer would have predicted.